Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Gerard Toal, and this is a short lecture on Affect-Discourse research on world politics in social science, with an emphasis on some of the things that are occurring in international relations theory and political science. So there are a few points I want to begin with. By now you will have grasped that the set of distinctions that come with the affect literature often distinguish between affect, feelings, and emotion. Here we want to talk about the distinction between affect and discourse. And the thing that one needs to grasp is that you need to think of this as an interface. That while we think we know that discourse is fairly straightforward, it's about talk, it's about representation, it's about text. By and large, it is, or at least its exemplary moments are. But it is, as you know from studying discourse, also about practice. And it's also about ritual, and it's also about norms. And some of these things that are unsaid. And it is necessarily effortful, necessarily requiring the mobilization of the body, necessarily requiring socialization, habitus, and even habitat, a sense of milieu, a sense of place. So therefore, when we think of it that way, the discursive is not as straightforward as it appears, and it does have an affective somatic connection. So the affective discourse interface is really one that we need to understand as joined together. And so what has happened over the last 2 decades with the affective turn in social science is to really uncover this affective foundation and also the affective force of discourse a lot more. Now, one of the obvious reasons for that within Anglo-American social science is, of course, 9/11 and the particular shock of that horrible day and the way in which it became a moment which was traumatic for a lot of people, not only who were in New York and Washington, D.C., but also who were watching on television. And it was seen as an attack on the nation, the United States, and then also even on an attack on the West. Now, how that played itself out, of course, is really actually quite a complicated question. But we all know what happened politically after that, with the launching of the global war on terror and the like, and then the mistakes that were made in that, and the particular affect generated by those mistakes. The question of torture, the question of the invasion of Iraq. So the social science community has been thinking and working through these issues for a long, long time. Obviously, Judith Butler's work, particularly the books Precarious Life and Frames of War, were very influential amongst political theorists. But in political science, Jenny Atkins's work on trauma and memory of politics, which deals with conditions well before 9/11. It's only in the conclusion that she addresses 9/11. I think that book came out in 2003, as well as works like those by Andrew Ross, which came out a few years ago, University of Chicago Press book, and a series of essays throughout political science by Jonathan Mercer at the University of Washington and Netta Crawford are kind of cardinal or distinctive, celebrated essays pulling together this theme of affect and discourse and how it can be related to the study of political science. I should also mention Elizabeth Anker's work from 2014 on Orgies of Feeling on melodrama, which sort of addresses film studies, and she's actually in political science now at GW. And then a book which has just come out, Emma Hutchinson's book on affective communities in world politics. So there's a lot, and these are only not necessarily the tip of the iceberg, because this research is not, in one sense, like front and center in mainstream political science, which tends to still be quite conservative in its theorizing. Rather, it is work that is occurring more on the margins, but is occurring and is increasing in significance within political science. Now, outside of political science, in my own discipline of geography, it has the whole kind of non-representational theory, and the affective turn has been very influential. So the readings that I've assigned for you here, to just give you some flavor of those, I start with an essay that I wrote in 2003, which was just as the Bush administration proclaimed the end of the Iraq War and or the end of kinetic operations with the mission accomplished speech. And I look at 9/11 as a somatic marker, drawing upon the work of William Conley, who is seeking to theorize how the work of neuroscience, Damasio and others, is changing how we think about thinking and how we think about representation. So what I do is I draw upon that to think about 9/11 as a moment which is a somatic marker for the United States as a nation, and then the creation of an affective community out of the suffering and the trauma and the spectacle of violence of that day and the horror of it. But also how that quickly transitions in the rhetoric of the Bush administration towards a community of revenge, a community seeking revenge. And so I look at this country and western singer and his particular performance before the Pentagon with Donald Rumsfeld in 2003. And then generally also discuss the theme of the transfer of affect, the transmission of it from 9/11 towards Iraq, and how in order to deal with the terrorism we have to invade Iraq, and that's sort of what Colin Powell was concerned about as a bait and switch, and how that occurred, and that is part of the affective economy of the global war on terror. So that's just to give you some sense of some of the thinking that went on in the wake of 9/11 about affect. Now, what I've assigned for you to read is a forum in International Studies review from 2017, from this year, which was put together by Simon Kossuth, who is a German theorist. And what I've represented here for you is, I think, a very useful diagrammatic representation of the themes that he outlines and on this discourse emotion nexus. So how do you study affect? How do you study emotion? And in part the answer is you can study it through doing a particular type of discourse analysis, but it is an affect attentive form of discourse analysis, which is looking for such things as the emotion name framing, where you have certain emotions being used as frames for particular moods and particular situations. You have emotional connotations, which is somewhat different. You're not necessarily naming the particular situation with a certain mood. I am angry, but you're using loaded negative and positive terms and analogies and so on and so forth, as well as conveying maybe the sense of duration and a sense of intensity of the terms. Then you have you can study affect and emotion by looking at emotional metaphors and analogies, emotional othering, where you're essentially projecting onto others anger or evil intention, or and this particular sort of distinction between they're angry, we're rational. That's a sort of basis of Orientalism, and it's a basis of sort of classic strategies of othering that are occurring. And then there's a discussion of the intertextuality of emotions, and that's really quite an interesting one, because that is looking at the ways in which, let's say, a theme of victimhood or a theme of humiliation, which may play itself out or resonate from a certain event that has occurred, is then tied back to previous humiliations and previous affective experiences. So, for example, China's emergence as a great power in part is about overcoming past humiliation inflicted upon China by the great powers, and so therefore this sense of pride and prestige and needing to assert this in the face of other great powers is we need to sort of understand the contemporary moment by understanding that there's a whole intertextuality to these particular emotions, and some of the essays, I think Hall's essay really gives you a sense of that in the case of Japan. Then there's a performativity question, interpolation of emotions, where you have, and this is where I use some of Hall's thing, emotionally provocative discourse, emotionally evocative discourse, cueing particular social emotions. And then you can also study, and this goes beyond what Kasuth outlines, you can study indications of somatic experience, and that is it, where someone goes, oh my goodness, where there's you're studying something, maybe you're studying a text, or you're studying a video, a broadcast, and you can see how a particular event is registering in a person's face, in how they're in their body and their particular body posture and so on and so forth. You can read their body language. That is another way in which you're doing discourse analysis, which is attentive to, which gets you to emotion, which gets you to affect. And you're looking at affective, discursive constructs here, which are connected to, larger social emotions. And it's not simply that this is individual. It may be individualized in a person, but it's not an individual, unique emotion. This is something which is produced socially. It is the individual as a state, feeling like a state. So that's what is an object of analysis here. So then the forum goes through a series of different contributors. All of them are really very interesting and fascinating. So Hall dealing with emotionally indicative discourse, provocative and invocative. And the term invocative, I had a little bit of trouble understanding exactly what he means by invocative. So let me read it to you. What he says on page 10. So the discourse is emotionally invocative when it deploys emotions socially and even politically as a consequential reference. Emotionally invocative discourse cites emotions to draw upon, leverage, and harness the social significance they possess. So that's in part intertextuality of emotions. And it is something that that he gives examples of here. In one sense, he doesn't use this phrase, but it's sort of emotional speech acts, and the ways in which the certain speech acts are deliberately crafted to resonate with the past, and particular scenes in the past. So that's Hall's essay. Wolf's essay, he's very much concerned with questions of respect, disrespect, and so he, even though there's sort of problems with distinguishing between the cognitive and the somatic, because the cognitive, just having a thought in your brain in and of itself, it's somatic. You require the brain you require a body in order to have thoughts. But there's this, nevertheless, distinction that is made between a sort of a somatic experience of your body, and then an experience of thinking, and then the action, what you do afterwards, what you're going to do, how you perform, and so on and so forth. So bearing in mind that these are sort of heuristic distinctions, which actually are studying something which is very much unified, and then you'll have a sense of the ways in which this can be helpful to break down a particular moment or particular structure or particular conjuncture. Ty Solomon's essay deals with the ways in which we can interpret, contextualize, and historicize emotional productive power, and he situates it within an essay on productive power in international relations. It's about sort of the ways in which this relates to the creation of subjectivities, the creation of identities, the creation of norms, and the like. So that is sort of constructivist IR, and an affective, emotional dimension of constructivist IR. And then the last essay is by the Australian theorist Emma Hutchinson and Ronald Bleecker, and they actually are figures who have done some really interesting work, and they put together a previous forum in the journal International Theory from 2014, and I'll put their essay Theorizing Emotions in World Politics. I'll make that available to you, although some of the themes in it you will be familiar with. In this forum, the 2017 forum, they talk about the distribution of the sensible, Rancière's phrase, and that really means the thinkable, what is visible, what is possible to see and possible to think. And they talk about how the study of affect can be related to Foucault's work and to the study of states and how states exercise power through emotion, and then how resistance to the state can draw upon emotion too. So overall, these essays, I think, give you a very good sense of where political sciences or international relations is on thinking about world politics and how one can approach the study of affect and the sort of affective emotion, feeling, representation, performance nexus. There's a lot of exciting research to be done in this particular field, and I hope that some of you who are watching this will be doing that research in the future. Okay, so let me stop there. Thank you.